So yesterday, August 18th, Wizards of the Coast released some playtest material for 1D&D, which is the next incarnation of Dungeons & Dragons, and it has some great stuff in it. Hi everyone, I'm Nick Olivo, and I want to share the 5 things I'm most excited about from the 1D&D playtest material. So let's start with the races. Humans, elves, dwarves, dragonborn, halflings, gnomes, tieflings, they're all still there with some subtle tweaks. Orcs are a playable race now. They were always there from Volos, but now they're core. And interestingly, they've done away with half-orcs and half-elves, and instead what we get are rules on how to create a character whose parents were members of 2 different humanoid races. So you can be half-dwarf and half-elf. Now, from a mechanical standpoint, the way this works is you pick one of those races to be like your game mechanic race. So you are a dwarf from a game mechanic standpoint, but from a visual standpoint, you can have both elven and dwarvish features. So you could have the amazing dwarvish beard and the pointed elven ears. And I think that would make for some really cool characters that can be created as a result of this. Now, there's not a way to mix and match the mechanical traits, which I think would probably make things overpowered, but I think it's still going to be a really cool thing as we go forward. We also have a new race called Ardlings, and these feel like the celestial counterpart to Tieflings, kind of like what Aasimar were. So Ardlings have celestial abilities, they can manifest spectral wings every day, and they have humanoid bodies and animal heads, which makes me think of the Egyptian pantheon. Now, one last thing, and probably the biggest change that's been made to races, is your race no longer determines your ability score bonuses. That's handled in the next thing that I want to talk about, which is your background. Hands down, backgrounds are the thing I'm most excited about from this playtest material. Just like in 5th edition, your background determines what your character's life was like prior to them becoming an adventurer. Maybe you were a farmer, or a city guard, or an acolyte at the temple. But unlike 5th edition, 1D&D gives you the ability to customize your background and tailor it exactly to the vision you have of what your character's life would be like. I used to play a rogue who was an art thief, and what he would do was steal expensive paintings, make forgeries of them, and then sell the forgeries while keeping the original for himself. And I could use the charlatan background to get some of those things that he would need, like the forger's kit and deception, or I could use the criminal background to get some of those skills, but honestly, there was no one single background that would let me have all the things that a forger would do, that would give me the proficiency with painter's tools and with the forgery kit and with deception and so on. But now we could create our own custom forger background that would fit that character right down to the ground. So your background gives you the ability to choose which ability scores you want to bump, gives you 2 skills to choose that you are proficient with, lets you choose what tool you want to be proficient with, lets you choose a language that you speak, and gives you 50 gold that you can spend on whatever equipment you want. And the cherry on top is that your background also gives you a free feat at 1st level. So let's talk about that next. I started playing D&D back in the 3.5 days, and in that edition, every character got a feat every 3 levels. So level 1, 3, 6, and so on, you got a feat. And that was great because it really let you customize your character and make them unique. And I was really bummed out when 5th edition came along and made feats optional. And not only were they optional, if your DM did allow them, you could only take them in place of an ability score increase. But 1D&D brings feats back again. Feats are core, and you get 10 of them in the playtest material. And there are some old favorites in there, like Magic Initiate, but there's some cool new ones too, like the Crafter feat, that lets you have proficiency with 3 tools, gives you a 20% discount when buying non-magical items, and lets you craft items 20% faster. My Art Forger rogue would have really loved that. But another cool feat that's new is called Musician, which gives you proficiency with 3 musical instruments and lets you play a song that grants your allies inspiration. And that brings me to the next thing I want to talk about. I love 5th edition's inspiration mechanic, but in the games I've been a player in, it hasn't seen a lot of use. And I think that's because rules as written Inspiration is intended to be a reward for role-playing your character's personality traits and ideals and flaws, and those can be subjective things to gauge. So as a result, players aren't given inspiration very often, and when they are, they hold on to it very tightly and only spend it in dire emergencies. And while it's possible for one player to give their inspiration to another, I've never actually seen that happen, probably because it was so hard for that initial player to earn the inspiration in the first place. But in 1D&D, you gain inspiration anytime you roll a nat 20. And it doesn't matter if that nat 20 was on an attack roll, a saving throw, or a skill check, you roll a nat 20, you now have inspiration. Just like before, inspiration will give you advantage on a roll, and just like before, you can only ever have one inspiration at a time, but now, if you roll a nat 20 and you already have inspiration, you just give that inspiration to somebody else at the table, and you don't worry about that you're never going to see another inspiration ever again. Now, one thing that is different is that inspirations expire when you start a long rest, so you can't hoard them anymore. The game is actively encouraging you to spend your inspirations before you go to sleep. Now, certain feats, like the musician one I mentioned earlier, can give you inspiration, and humans gain inspiration every time they finish a long rest. So if you're playing a human, you wake up every morning refreshed, invigorated, and inspired, and ready to take on the day. Probably after that first cup of coffee. The last thing I want to talk about are rests. When Monsters of the Multiverse came out, a lot of people were speculating that D&D was doing away with short rests because they couldn't find references to short rests in that book. And that prompted a lot of questions. The one on my mind was, how the heck would warlocks work if we didn't have short rests? But the playtest material does include short rests. The musician feat that I talked about earlier works on both a short and a long rest. And if you're taking a long rest and you get interrupted, so long as you were resting for at least an hour, you instead get the benefits of a short rest. And that, I think, makes a lot of sense. You know, if you think about it, you're done traveling for the day, your party has made camp, they're sitting around the campfire having dinner, and then they get waylaid by goblins. They would have had some time to rest and recover some resources. So while it's not as good as getting the full long rest in, you do get something back, and I think that's really good. So those are the 5 things I'm most excited about with the 1D&D playtest material. What are you most excited about? Sound off in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. And in the meantime, thanks for watching, folks. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and consider subscribing. And until next time, have a great day.